Hello everyone and welcome to the Autism Education Trust. This briefing is for anyone working closely with autistic pupils to support the transition back to the education setting. It will give you some ideas of how to gain the pupil and the parent voice and what you will need to take into consideration when carrying out a risk assessment. Before you start this presentation, please make sure that you've downloaded the handout as you may wish to look at it as we go. By the end of the briefing, we hope that you will have learned how to gain the views of autistic children and young people and their parents and carers about how best to support their transition back to education settings, and to understand what your risk assessment should cover. Under the SEND Code of Practice, both the pupil and the parent voice are paramount, and under the Children and Families Act, this is specifically identified as being important. Remember that any significant transitions for autistic pupils, for example moving between one phase or another, or times like now with returning back to education after a long period out, it's always a bespoke job and relies very much on that positive relationship between home and school. It therefore starts with gaining the autistic pupil and parent-carent voice. So how well do you know the pupil? Has the pupil's profile of needs and strengths changed since they've been out of school? So you may have been working very closely with the pupil before lockdown, and you will have been very familiar with their profile of strengths and their profile of needs. However, lockdown will have had a major impact on lots of different families in different ways. What has worked well for the pupil and their family during lockdown, but what hasn't worked so well? And what are they most worried about with the return to school? But also, what are they looking forward to? So it's important to find out all of this information prior to the autistic pupil returning to school. Find out what have been the positives and negatives of lockdown from both the pupil's point of view, but also the parent-carer point of view. And it's also really helpful to know what their biggest concerns are around the transition back to school. And we will help you to obtain these views in the next few slides. So we've given you a handout that has an appendices section, and included in the appendices are some templates for gaining the pupil and parent voice. So one of the templates specifically asks for information about the lockdown experience, and there is one for the pupil and one for the parent to fill out. It's also important to remember that not everybody will want to provide this information in a written format. So do give a variety of ways to be able to share this information. That might be a PowerPoint presentation or a video, for example. It's really important when you're gaining the voice of other people to give them the freedom to present this in the way that works for them best. We've also included a template of a basic one-page profile. So for any written pupil documentation, it's really important to be able to include a photograph of the child so that any member of staff can quickly identify who the profile belongs to. But it should also be eye-catching, so use coloured paper and personalise it to fit in with the child or young person's special interests. It's critically important that these profiles show a really clear picture of the pupil's strengths, the challenges, and the best way of supporting the pupil. And this documentation must be made available to all staff who are in contact with the pupil. So what do the pupils themselves say about important considerations with the return to education? And what do they think that staff need to take into consideration? So they think it will be important to make sure that only a small amount of pupils return to education to start with, so it's not too overwhelming for autistic pupils. They think that the schools should ensure that pupils' routines at home have started in advance of going back to school. So remembering that they have been off for longer than the 6-week period for the summer holidays. And ensuring that there is an extended transition period. So that period will allow that pupil to settle back into school, as they have been off for a very long time. And they do not think that they should go back into exams straight away. They felt that it would be important for there to be cleaning stations and how to use these, as well as information about how equipment will be cleaned throughout the day. And also to take into consideration that it's important to make sure that pupils' mental health is stable before actually reintroducing any education or learning. So now we're going to spend a bit of time looking at risk assessments. Any transition will need to be managed carefully for all pupils returning to education, but specifically autistic pupils who can find any kind of change particularly challenging, and it's likely to cause them quite a lot of heightened anxiety around this time. So the transition will need to be bespoke to an individual child, and completing a risk assessment will help to do this. So the government has not provided any specific format for the risk assessment. They are trusting schools, educational settings, and the local authorities to put their own arrangements in place for this. However, there are some consistencies with what needs to be included in the risk assessment, and this slide looks at what those should be. So the risk assessment should include information about any potential health risks. It should also identify the risks if the child has an education healthcare plan. What are the risks if the provision in Section F is not going to be implemented? How can their needs be met in other ways, whether that be at home or at school, if they're not getting that full provision within the education healthcare plan? And if they are staying at home, what are the risks to the siblings in that situation? The risk assessment must include the impact of the individual's well-being, of changes to routine or the way in which that provision is delivered, and any safeguarding risk for the child, and the social workers should be involved with any looked after children, and they should all have an input in the risk assessment. And any other out of school or out of college risk or vulnerability, and that may include exploitation. Local authorities or education settings should decide together who is best placed to undertake the risk assessment, but it should always include the views of the autistic pupil, their parent carer, and the education setting, along with any health or social care workers where appropriate. They should not be written by one member of staff, no matter how well that member of staff knows the pupil. The risk assessment is a dynamic document and should be as a result of a discussion with everybody listed here. So that will be the child, the young person, the parent carer, the education settings, but the health or social care worker where the child or person has one. For further Autism Education Trust resources, please visit our website at www.autismeducationtrust.org.uk, where you will find our COVID-19 Information Centre. You will find a range of materials to help you support autistic pupils return to school. There is a selection of materials, including a 6 Tools for Teachers resource package, strategies on how to support autistic pupils who are experiencing heightened anxiety, and it also features information about the changes to legislation, some examples of social stories that you may use to support the autistic child to transition back. And there is also some articles by education specialists and some of our training partners to support that transition as well. We hope you have found this briefing useful.